Chapter 1, Foundations of Interpersonal Communication. Before we go any further, it's important for us to recognize some basics about the nature of interpersonal human communication and the elements that go into interpersonal communication. So first, let's look at what interpersonal communication is. What's the definition? Well, interpersonal communication is the verbal and the nonverbal interaction between two, sometimes more, people who are interdependent. You might say, what does interdependence mean? Well, interdependence means that there is some connection or relationship between the people. And I can tell you that interpersonal communication skills are really considered to be one of the most important for success in life and work. And I like to teach this course from the standpoint of the fact that you're being prepared to work, to interact in the world with other people. And so I will tell you that this is considered a soft skill, being able to communicate effectively and well, and it's invaluable to you to learn more about communicating. The first thing that we can talk about as far as IC or interpersonal communication might be that it is inherently relational. And what that means is simply that the nature of your relationship drives how you communicate. Think about this for a minute. You would communicate differently with me than you might with your mother. So the nature of our relationship could be said to drive how we communicate. But on the other hand, this is true as well. How you communicate drives the nature of your relationship. So let's take this again. How you communicate with me, if you're friendly, you're considerate, whether I'm the instructor or a friend, another person, how you communicate with me would drive the nature of the relationship, whether we're going to feel good about knowing each other or maybe not want to continue to be friends. So those two things, even though they're opposite sides of the same coin, but they are true. Interpersonal communication exists on what we call a continuum, and it ranges from highly or relatively impersonal communication all the way to the other end, to the highly personal. So here's the difference between those. Let's take an example first of the impersonal interpersonal communication. An example of this might be when you go into, say, Wendy's to order lunch, and you give your order to the server, and there's an interaction there. You definitely have communication, and it is considered impersonal, or rather interpersonal, albeit it is impersonal, but it is interpersonal because it is still dependent. You're dependent on each other. You're dependent on each other because you depend on the server to get your order right and give you your food in a reasonable amount of time. And they are dependent on you to give them your order and to pay. So that's what we consider an impersonal interaction. But of course, it's still interpersonal because during that time that we're communicating with one another, it's interpersonal. And then we get to the other end of the spectrum, to a highly personal interaction. And this would be someone you know something about, you've shared information about each other. We also have to realize that interpersonal communication always involves both verbal and nonverbal messages. So you have to be ready to recognize that there are nonverbal messages that go along with the words. For example, that server. Let's go back to the server at Wendy's. One server might say exactly the same words as another server, but the customer might get different messages from them if one server is smiling and looking the customer in the eye and nodding in response to orders, and the other server doesn't look at the customer, doesn't smile, and his actions are very fast. So those messages all add up to create one meaning. So we have to recognize that the verbal and the nonverbal go together to form the complete message. And we're not just talking about face-to-face here either. And we're not just talking about face-to-face or over the phone. No, we're talking here about texting between people, emails, instant messaging, certainly social networking, any type of communication between people can be interpersonal. We also have to recognize that messages are sent through different channels. And this follows up on the fact that nonverbal is just as valid as verbal and speaking words. It can be visual. We can get visual messages. We can get touch messages. We can get oral messages or through our ears. And often one message is sent through several channels at the same time. We're smiling while we're complimenting someone. We are waving someone in a direction while we're giving them directions. So messages can be sent through many channels simultaneously. Let's talk about the fact that communication is transactional. Well, a big part of what being transactional means is that we can be, or we are, both a sender and a receiver at the same time. You might think, well, how can this be? You know, my teacher is talking and I'm receiving. Well, a good example of this, well, let's pretend we're in the classroom. This is the easiest way to explain this. We're in the classroom and I'm in the front of the class explaining a concept, and you are receiving the message, absolutely. But at the same time, you're sending a message. How could this be so? Think about it. How could that be so? Well, I'm getting something from you in the way you're sitting, whether you have eye contact or are you staring off into space, your expressions, your acknowledgement, little things we do, nod our head, that kind of thing. So, or sitting perfectly still, that might send a message too. So, a big part of communication being transactional is that the sender and the receiver, we play both roles at the same time. To expand a little bit on and the fact that communication is transactional, let's realize that my response is going to determine how you respond back to me. So it's an ongoing process. It's always changing. It's interdependent on, for instance, you say something, then I respond back based on what you said. Then you send me another message based on my response, and so on and so forth. This is just a little diagram that illustrates how we're sending messages at the same time as we're receiving them. So we're both a sender and encoder of messages at the same time as we are receiving and decoding. I want to introduce the term feedback to you here. Feedback is a special type of message that comes in response to a message received. So basically, feedback is another word for response. You give me feedback after I send you a message. Communication occurs when one person or more sends and receives messages that occur within a context, and we're going to explain what a context is in a moment, are distorted by noise, has some effect, and provide some opportunity for feedback or a response. So we're going to talk about each one of these terms in gold, one at a time. What is context? What are we talking about here? Messages always occur within a context. Well, there are 4 contexts that are always present in any of our communication. The context of any communication has these 4 dimensions. The first one is the fact that there's always a physical context. We can't get away from this. We're in the world. We always have surroundings, whether it's in a classroom, we may be in Burt Walker 205, we might be in the Potter Center, we might be in the cafeteria, we might be sitting outside in the grass in a park. We can't escape there being a physical context or surroundings. Another context that's always present is the social psychological. And let's concentrate with this one on the relationship between people. It's also, there's a little more to it, the mood, the situation, but I think the most important part of this to remember is this represents the relationship between people. There's always a relationship between people. Aha. But what about 2 strangers, you might ask? Well, that's still a relationship. They're 2 strangers. So we can't avoid having this context. There's always a social psychological context. Another context that we can't get away from is the temporal context. This has to do with time, anything to do with time. And this can be the time of day, the time in the semester, the time in the season, the time during the summer, for instance, the time of the month, the time in history, the time in the hour in which you're getting the exam, was it the beginning of the hour, the end of the hour, that kind of thing. Anything to do with time. We can't escape time, can we? It's always there. And the last one is cultural context. We're going to go more into this in chapter 2, but we can't avoid culture. We always have cultural contexts, and it's something that we cannot avoid. Now, these 4 dimensions of context are always present anytime we communicate. The question is, this is the question, do any of them have an effect on the communication? They may or may not. The fact that we're in Burt Walker 205 versus the Justin Whiting 112 may not have much to do with changing the communication. But maybe if we're sitting in the middle of a bowling alley trying to hold class versus in a classroom, that could have an effect. So that's the question on any of these. Do they have an effect on how the communication develops?